today.
Many, many times I asked him to come to Washington, D.C. to testify not only for South Dakota Farmers Union, but for the National Farmers Union. He represents National Farmers Union well on many, many times each year, and it is a great pleasure that I introduce a great friend of the family farmers throughout the nation, Ben Radcliffe. Ben?
Well, thank you, Tony. It's a rare treat to be introduced by the National Farmers Union President. I really appreciate that. And I'd like to say that I'm more than pleased tonight that our insurance company and the agents that work for our insurance company were given the kind of recognition that they were before our convention. For a long time, we've been doing these sort of things for our co-ops. We parade our co-op people up here, and they're terribly important too. But we've never really done this kind of a thing before our convention audience for our insurance agents. And that was a great idea, Cliff, and we hope that we'll be doing that in the future. Well, I don't know, we've got people here from the West River and the East River. Some are called ranchers and some are called farmers. And I've even discovered that when I go out west and make a speech, they don't like to have me call them farmers. And I've never been able to really get any kind of a decent definition or a differential definition between a farmer and a rancher. But about 3 weeks ago, I was out in the West River, and an old rancher out there told me the difference. And that's the first time I'd known that. In all these years, now I know the difference. He said you can tell a rancher never plows up any more ground than his wife can hoe. That's a rancher. So all you guys, now you know the difference, as I do. Well, I gave a report this afternoon, and I'm not going to take a lot of time tonight, but there are some things that I'd like to visit with you about. And one of the things is that the family farm is finally being recognized for the value that it really is. We've got their attention now, the consumers that is, with the high cost of food, and that's not all that good, except that in some cases it provides a better price for what we have to sell. But we've got the attention of the consumers, and the consumers are becoming more aware of where food comes from. And the value of the family farm is coming into focus. And I know you've heard a lot of speeches about the family farm, but I think the consumers now are becoming more aware of the value of the family farm. And I made a speech over in Madison 2 or 3 weeks ago, in which I said America needs the family farm, and whoever was there reporting it put it in the headlines of the paper. And it said, Radcliffe says America needs the family farm. And I didn't know how good it looked till I saw that, but that is a statement of fact that has finally come into its own. The family farm, of course, is the envy of the world, the American family farm. We produce the diet or the food for our consumers at less than 20% of their total income, even now. And that's much less than any other country in the world. And after all, who is going to be the best custodian of the soil, where nearly all food comes from? Who will be the best custodian of that soil? The family living there, or some corporation, or some investor? And believe me, the consumers of our country are concerned about that. All this big talk about land use, all they're saying is that we're concerned about who's taking care of the land. What's the land going to be used for? And the family farm is going to come right out in the forefront in this discussion on land use. And maybe we'll even talk about land tenure, who's going to own the land, and not just what the land will be used for. And so the family farm has come to the forefront, and those of us who have been working for the family farm all of these years now are beginning to feel that it wasn't all in vain, and I'm sure sometimes we may well have thought that. But one of the things that we need to assure if the family farm is to survive is a fair price for what we have to sell. And in my opinion, that means a farm program. I don't think there's any way that the family farm or the farm family can stay in business nowadays without a farm program. And I don't think that we as farmers should even take too seriously the request that President Ford made the other day that we should plant all out, fence to fence. I don't think we should take that too seriously unless, on the other hand, our federal government assures us of a fair price when we do plant fence to fence. We've done that before. And so we need a farm program, and this afternoon I made the statement that we need to get the Cattlemen's Association on our team. Too often they've been against farm programs. I'm not sure they're hurting bad enough yet to join us in writing a good farm program, but I'm convinced that we're going to have their help to write and enact the kind of a farm program that will put a decent floor under farm and ranch production. When we get that job done, then I think we'll be on our way. Now, one of the things I think that we can do, short of going to Washington for these programs, it's always nice to be able to do something at least within our state boundaries. We could do a lot more with our cooperatives. This afternoon we had a fine co-op panel up here, Tony. We had representation from GTA and Central Exchange and from Farmers Union Marketing and Processing. And really, we've done a pretty fair job in grain marketing. We haven't gone overseas all that much, but GTA handles more grain than any other single grain handler in this four-state Northwest region. At least that's what I'm told. So we've done some things there. Senex and the other regional farm supply have done a great job in petroleum and other farm supplies. But the area that we haven't scratched, and the area that we're in the most trouble on now, of course, is livestock. We've tried cooperative livestock processing, and we're going to try some more. But we could be doing a lot more in that area, and maybe if we had some good livestock co-ops, some good processing cooperatives, livestock farmers wouldn't be in the terrible problem that they find themselves in right now. And we're working on that. The 5 state presidents in this region met just last week to talk about what we can do to put together a livestock marketing and livestock processing program. So we've got that in the mill, in the plans. Now, there are 2 or 3 things that we can do within the state legislature. I want to touch on them very briefly because I think it's important when we're talking about farm prosperity and seeing that the family farm survives, that we touch all the bases. And I think the passage of the Family Farm Act in the 1974 legislature was a tremendous victory. I mean a real big victory for the family farmers of South Dakota. There are now 5 states in the nation that have passed Family Farm Acts very similar to the one that we have. The most recent one, even since we passed ours, was Wisconsin, which came on with theirs in the spring, and of course we passed ours last winter. And what this does, in very brief summary, and it really will have some impact, you wait and see. It prohibits a corporation from going into the business of farming in South Dakota unless it meets particularly two criteria. One is that this corporation will have to be a family farm corporation, and we have those now, and they're not disturbed, and they won't be disturbed. And the other exception is that they have to be what is called a small corporation, or a subchapter S corporation under the Internal Revenue Service regulation. And that's simply a small corporation with no more than 10 stockholders with the same kind of stock. And at the end of the year, instead of paying taxes as a corporation, they may divide that profit up among their stockholders and pay as individuals. Now that couldn't possibly be a conglomerate or a corporation that goes public, so it pretty well limits corporate control and corporate even renting of farmland to small corporations or farm corporations. An existing corporation, no matter what size it is, can continue to farm, but is restricted and limited to its expansion by not over 20% in a 5-year period. So you see, we've got this thing pretty well nailed down. And in addition to that, there's a reporting requirement, and in April of every spring, every corporation that's engaged in farming will have to file a detailed report with the Secretary of State, and then we'll know exactly how much corporate farming there is going on in our state. Well, I say that is one real milestone in saving the family farm. Another area that we need to move on that we haven't, and Tony referred to that, and that's the matter of losing our rail transportation. And I won't spend a lot of time on that because we've talked about it before, but the loss of railroads in South Dakota is a real threat to profitable farming. Make no mistake about it. We are, for all purposes, a state of branch lines. We really don't have any main lines going through South Dakota. We don't have Amtrak, as you know. We're a branch line state, and we're seeing abandonment requests almost every month. There are 3 railroads doing business in South Dakota, and just one of those railroads alone, the Chicago and Northwestern, has 300 miles now up for abandonment. Now that's in a half a dozen different spur lines, about 300 miles. And our batting record of stopping these abandonments have been pretty poor. We've only stopped in the last 10 years, we've stopped about 10% of the rail abandonment that has been requested. I'll bet that there's hardly a one of you in driving to Huron today or yesterday that you didn't drive along or cross an abandoned railroad track. I just see them all over the state now, where they're pulling up the tracks. Now they're taking out the bridges, the good timber in the bridges, and they run the semi-truck down the old railroad bed and pick up the track and the rail, and it's gone. And it's not coming back unless something is done. And the cost? Well, our railroad task force, of which I am a member, has conducted some studies that shows that last winter, when it was hard to get boxcars, and last spring and last summer, a wheat farmer who had to ship his wheat eventually to the Twin Cities took as much as 40 cents a bushel less for that wheat if he had to ship it by truck than he could have received finally if it had gone by rail. 40 cents a bushel. I talk about an economic impact. You know, what does it cost to build a railroad? What does it cost not to build a railroad? Emil's on the task force with me. And it costs millions and millions of dollars annually not to have those railroads. So let's talk about building some railroads. And it's not enough to organize a Save Our Railroad group around a line that's being abandoned. We were down in Winter last week. Emil and I were down there to attend a task force meeting, and the local people were invited in to talk to us because they're losing a line from Winter to Norfolk, Nebraska. That's the only line that serves that whole area. And if they lose that, they've lost their railroad. And we heard witnesses, and they reported that part of that track is 5-mile-an-hour track. Well, that's pretty slow. One farmer said that for years he's been able to pass up the train when he went home for lunch, you know, with his tractor and road gear, but now he's passing up that train with a plow in the ground, and he said that's bothering him a little bit. A 5-mile-an-hour track is pretty slow track. And besides that, they told us that that track down there, even if it was in good repair, could not haul a modern hopper car. Couldn't haul a modern hopper car full of grain. So we've got to do a lot more than save our railroads. We really don't have railroads to save. We've got to talk about building railroads. Getting right back into the business of building railroads, because the highways can't handle that kind of traffic. The cost of moving freight by track is better by a 6-to-1 ratio than highway costs, and that doesn't take into account the repair of the roads. And so I think we're going to have to take a look at public financing of our rail system. And that's not new. The state of Vermont has been in the railroad business for 10 years. They own 3 spur lines. One of them is over 100 miles long. They repaired these lines and rented them back to the railroad company to run their trains on. And whether we do it at the state level, and I personally believe that the federal government is the part of our public financing that should really get into the railroad business. But they do it in Canada, they do it in Europe. But until we can get the federal government to do these things, we're going to have to do it piecemeal. And there are a lot of different ways that we can approach it. one thought is, and I don't know how viable it is, you know, we have water districts, we have soil conservation districts, irrigation districts. Why not have a transportation district that's built around or encompasses a particular line, like that line down at Winner? Wouldn't be hard to draw a circle around the towns and the farmers that that line serves. And this is just an idea that we're exploring in our task force. How about a transportation district that would be legally constituted? Maybe you could levy a mill or two for administrative purposes, and then be able to maybe issue revenue bonds or to accept federal money. I think there's some rural area development money available for this sort of thing. But we need to begin now to do something about saving our railroads. And as I go around and talk to different groups about railroads getting involved, or the public getting involved in rail transportation, I find great acceptance on the part of the people. I don't find that kind of acceptance on the part of congressmen. Maybe, Emil, this is one case. Maybe we have a lot of cases where the people are way out ahead of the congressman, and we need to be telling our story even louder than we are. Okay, then finally, the other thing I think that we need to be doing to save the family farm is to reform South Dakota's tax structure. I don't think there's any one aspect of South Dakota that you could term more of a disgrace than our tax structure. We literally take from the poor and give to the rich. Governor Knipe has said that our tax system is not only inequitable, it is immoral. It is immoral, and it is. When you take from the poor and give to the rich with the kind of a tax structure that we have. And so Farmers Union has been working for years, as you know, to change that tax structure, and I won't go into a detail of how we hope to do it because it's spelled out in our program. But let me say this. It took us 6 years to get the Family Farm Act passed. Senator Knipe, who was then a senator, introduced the first Family Farm Act 6 years ago. I think it was in 1968. We passed the bill in 1974, 6 years. Well, remember, it was only in 1970 that we had the initiated measure on the ballot. I guess that was only 4 years ago, Maynard. But I'm hoping that we can beat that 6-year record with tax reform, and maybe this year, with the new legislature being elected, we can pass some tax reform legislation that will get us into the 20th century with our tax structure. We've worked long and hard on tax reform, and with your help and with the help of other groups, such as the group we had represented here this afternoon, organized labor, we're going to get some help from them. We're going to get this job done. In closing then, let me say, let us join hands with our friends, whoever they may be, to make our most concentrated effort ever to tell the story and achieve a greater success for the family farm. Our challenge is clear. Our goals are in sight. Let's bring a new era of vitality to rural America. Thank you. How fast does it go? It took 3 weeks to go from Gregory to Winter. It doesn't go quite 5 miles an hour. Thank you. Now, I think we're doing pretty well with our time, Tony. It's my turn to introduce our president for his address to this convention. And Tony, we're always glad to have you here. A convention in South Dakota just wouldn't be complete without the National Farmers Union President here. And I can't remember when we didn't have Jim Patton before you and now you at our convention. Tony is not only a national leader, he's a world leader. And at the last meeting of the International Federation of Agriculture Producers, Tony was elected vice president of that international farm organization, which represents 45 countries from around the world. Tony originally started up in Kansas. He started out in Kansas as a Kansas farm boy. Went to Denver to work for Jim Patton, became secretary of the National Farmers Union, and now for the last nine years, on his 9th year, doesn't seem possible, does it? For the last 8 years and going on his 9th year, Tony has been president of the National Farmers Union. And I'm always proud every time I get an opportunity to introduce Tony, and this is no exception. Tony, it's my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. President Ben Radcliffe, President Roy Holman of the Utah-Idaho Farmers Union, my longtime associate, President Ray Novak of the Farmers Union Insurances, our very fine state manager, Cliff Ott, King Wendell Johnson and Queen Judy Johnson, members and friends of the South Dakota Farmers Union. Gosh, it's wonderful to be here again, to see my old and dear friends and have the opportunity to make new ones. I see Emil Lorix down there in the audience, and when he was National Secretary Treasurer, a million years ago it seems now, like Emil, when he was National Secretary Treasurer, I came into the Farmers Union as his assistant, and I have very fond memories of that time. It's good to see you, Emil, and I appreciate your occasional letters telling me what the hell to get that busy doing. He's still like my old boss. He used to tell me what to do when I worked for him, and every now and then he still writes to me and tells me about what we ought to be doing. Well, I've been mad. I've had a slow burn for many weeks, and when I started to come here to the South Dakota Convention, several of my associates in the Denver office and my secretary wondered when I was going to get around to dictating a speech, or at least getting some things down on paper, and I said, no, I just didn't feel like I wanted to do it. I didn't know where to take in. I was sore, and the best I would do was come up with a press conference, with a press statement, so that if I had a press conference here, I could at least give them something, give them some idea of what I was thinking. So I'd like, Ben, for a few minutes to visit with the Farmers Union members and friends up here in South Dakota, share some of my frustrations with you, and maybe we ought to try to figure out what are some of the first and top priority things that we ought to address ourselves to. First of all, I'd like to say that a half dozen times in the last year I have gone to meetings, very important meetings, having to do with food and population, famine and starvation around the world, hunger here at home. And I've been at these meetings with consumer groups, education groups, labor groups, religious people of goodwill who have a sincere interest in what's happening in the United States and in the world. And I hear them talk about how we have to make food available here at home and food available abroad. And after the first such meeting, I've been one of the guys at these meetings that have said, wait a minute, now let's start thinking about how you're going to get the food. Everybody kind of takes for granted that the farmer is somehow or other going to produce this food, and that it's always going to be there. And I raise the flag and say, It's not going to be there unless there is a stable agriculture. And if you don't go about working with us on bringing about stability in agriculture, then it'll be a very sad day for America and a sad day for the world. And I have good credentials when I say tough things at this meeting, at these kinds of meetings. Just recently I was at a food and population conference sponsored by the University of Denver. And I said much the same thing. I said, let's talk about the farmers' share in this program. And I said, I've got good credentials to talk about it, because for the last 30 years, there's been one organization in the United States, above all others, one organization related to agriculture. Obviously, our people on the religious front and our churches have been concerned about this for many years, but I said that the foremost person, the foremost organization in terms of having worldwide concern and concern here at home were Jim Patton and were the Farmers Union. So we've had credentials for years about how we felt we ought to be dealing with hunger in this country, and how we ought to have abundant food supplies, and how we ought to have enough so that we could establish some world reserves. And with that kind of, I remember, Ben, that Farmers Union was the foremost advocate for food for peace. And if I remember correctly, the first administrator of the Food for Peace program was your old great Senator George McGovern in the early 60s, when President Kennedy made him the administrator of the Food for Peace program. So Farmers Union has the Farmers Union has the credentials to be able to say honestly and fairly to people of the United States and the world that it is just not right or equal for farmers to be called on to produce abundant supplies and pay for it. In other words, I think all the people of this country ought to share with us the cost of emergency stocks, and the affluent nations of the world like Germany and like Japan and others, and I'll not get into the business of taking time to name them, but they too have a responsibility in the world for making sure that there are adequate supplies of food for hungry people around the world, and although they can't produce surpluses, they've got money and can help pay for them. And the day that the United States and Canada, with some help from Australia, should go on carrying all of the stocks of the world at the cost of the farmer, either via low income or for the farmer to carry reserves, has to come to an end. And I'm happy to tell you people here this evening that at meetings in Pennsylvania, in Chicago, in Minneapolis, in Denver, Colorado, the consumers understand what I'm saying. You know, other groups now, the religious people challenged me very hard in Pennsylvania. It really bothered several religious groups in Pennsylvania to have me say that farmers were not going to produce abundant supplies in this country just for the exercise. That no one else in this country did that kind of production, and we weren't going to do it. And at first blush, several of the religious leaders got up and challenged me. But after we talked about it for a while, they got up and said, we cannot find fault with what you're saying. Now, having just spent these couple minutes of setting the record clear on where Farmers Union stands on feeding the hungry in this country and in the world, I now want to talk about some of the things that I've been involved in the last month. The first one was a presidential invitation to attend the pre-summit meeting on inflation, the meeting that was set aside for agriculture in Chicago. There were 55 delegates. Each of us was given the right to file a statement. They had asked us to address ourselves to 5 questions, and each of us did. And we came together at Chicago, but we didn't have the kind of a meeting in Chicago that the bankers had. Because when the bankers had a pre-summit conference to get ready to advise the president, it was just bankers. And then when labor had a pre-summit meeting to advise the president, it was a meeting of just labor. But when we got to Chicago, we found that there were farmers' representatives there, but agribusiness was well represented. Some of the banks were represented in terms of farm credit. Education was represented. In other words, it was a mixed bag. There wasn't any clear-cut voice just for farmers. In fact, I think if there'd been a way to put it to a test or to a vote, farmers would have come out second best. But the farm groups that were there, for the most part, the milk producers, the wheat people, corn people, Farmers Union, Grange, NFO, a number of us were saying the same thing, and we were making an expression of what farmers were for. That if we were, you see, at that conference, everybody said the 2 most important things in America today in terms of inflation were food costs and energy costs. But we spent a lot of time talking about energy, but nobody spent a lot of time talking about how were you going to get farm production in order that you could get food, you know, to solve an inflation problem. Well, we went from Chicago to Washington, D.C., and there the thing was structured tight and tough, and agriculture made its presentation. And this is the first opportunity I've had to say this anywhere, but I want to say of all the sector reports that were made, those by the bankers, those by the manufacturers, those by labor, I thought agriculture made the poorest presentation at the summit conference. And we made it because, and it was made out of the Chicago meeting, but it was such a mixed bag in Chicago that there were no clear-cut directives, and the farmer's voice really wasn't presented. It was a voice that was mixed up with agribusiness and with all of the other things that creep into the overall agriculture picture. And we didn't come out of that summit conference, I thought, very well. I tried the second day just to be able to get to the microphone to file a 5-minute minority report, and I couldn't do it. They wouldn't take any comments from the floor that were more than a minute. And then it was structured so the last day that there wasn't any way to get to the microphone for a minute. And I didn't think farmers got a story told, so we had to tell it in the press. I had to tell my story at press conference and news meetings, and I was urged and pressed on by other people who were at the conference for other agricultural organizations, asked me to take the lead in that front. But there was such a barrage of material came out that we didn't get it said. Now, in the last week or so, the President Ford, has announced his game plan for dealing with inflation. And I want to say to you that there was nothing in it for farmers. You see, he could have done something right off the bat, because since 1970, we have lost over 150,000 dairy farmers in this country. And since 1970, over 1 1/3 million cows have been taken out of dairy production, moved into the market at a high rate this last year to compete with livestock. In other words, one factor, one part of our problem on the livestock front is the competition from the dairy front, from, as I said, in the last 4 years of 1.3 million cows moving into market. Now, in the total scheme of things, that might not be a big number, but if you start thinking of 1 and 2 and 3 percentage points, it's a factor. But here's the dairy farmer going out of business. The president could have announced the raising of the support rate for manufacturing milk to 90% of parity. That would have been something tangible. The president said that he was in favor of deregulating natural gas at the wellhead. That's going to cost every farmer in the United States money, because natural gas is the feedstock that's used for fertilizer, for nitrogen. And when they deregulate that price, you can bet the bottom dollar, if you've got one, you can bet it that natural gas prices are going to move up right now. And when they move up, the fertilizer companies are going to have to pay more for gas, and they're going to hand it back to us when we buy fertilizer, when we buy nitrogen. So when I say there was nothing in it for farmers, I mean there was nothing in it, because all we had was comments that said they were going to make sure that we were going to have an adequate supply of fuel and an adequate supply of fertilizer. But at what cost? If natural gas drives up nitrogen, it's going to cost us more than we already have. Now, I ask anybody to find anything in the statement that the president made that said anything tangible about what was going to happen for farmers. There was no talk about raising target prices, about bringing the escalator clause into effect, about doing something on the livestock front, on the milk front. But there was something in that bag for farmers, for businessmen. Businessmen he offered a 10% investment tax credit. And I can remember, Ben, every time we've had to fuss, about investment tax credits, we've had to fight like the devil to get farmers counted in. Business was counted in, but always there was some argument whether that should be extended to farmers as well. It wasn't mentioned where farmers were concerned. The businessmen got deductions from dividends on preferred stocks. They got liberalized capital gains taxes. And then he said that he promised to halt regulatory agencies from imposing rules and requirements that might allegedly hike the costs of industrial and consumer products. In other words, he said, we're going to make it possible for you to make profits, because when there's a regulation that might stand in your way, we're going to raise it. We're going to move it out. We're not going to have any smoke devices on cars in 1975 or 76, as had been indicated, because these are the type of things that they're going to just squelch, and then that will change the ball game where business is concerned. Now, our livestock industry is in the doldrums. Our dairy industry is down. The only sector in agriculture that has somewhat of a price advantage at the moment are the grain farmers. One of the things I said at Chicago, and I had Secretary Butts sitting right behind me, and the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, Mr. Pogue, and the chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee, Mr. Talmadge. So in Chicago, where they asked us to limit our comments to 2 minutes, I finally took 10 minutes just before the noon recess and said some things that I felt had to be said. And one of them that I said to Mr. Butts was that grain prices were up at the moment because we had a disaster in this country on weather. We had too much rain early in the year and not enough in the summer, and we've got a short crop. But I asked the secretary at the Chicago meeting what grain prices would be if we had raised 6 7/10 billion bushels of corn, as the department estimated in January and in February and in March that we were going to have. I asked them at Chicago, what would be the price of corn today if we had 6 7/10 billion bushels of corn? And what would be the price of soybeans if we had 1.5 billion bushels instead of the 1.25 billion bushels we're going to have? And what would be the price of wheat if we'd had 2 2/10 billion bushels of wheat rather than the 1.7 billion bushels that we got? You see, the reason, if we had gotten that crop without any kind of floors, I want to tell you that the grain farmers would be in the same boat as the livestock producers and as the dairy farmers. Now, what's in the ring for us next year? And as long as I'm talking about livestock, just remember one thing. If you think back with me a minute. You remember we had the corn blight in 69, early 70? And there was, all kinds of excitement, and the Secretary Hardin came out and said, open up the gates, produce, we've got to have corn. And as always, the American farmer responded. And you'll remember that we had the biggest corn crop we'd ever had in this country. And all you folks have to think, and you people here in South Dakota know the story better than I. I come from wheat country. You people understand livestock. You just think back that part of the problems of our livestock today traces back to that bumper corn crop in 1970, and corn prices fell, from whatever they were in July, they plunged down 40, 50 cents up to October, and everybody started feeding livestock. A lot of people got into the livestock business that should never have been there. But you see, there was cheap corn, there was cheap feed, and we're paying the price for it now. Part of the price that the livestock industry has been paying this last year is because there was too much livestock in the country. There's no other way to add it and subtract it. We can talk about markets and we can talk about how it should have moved, but the facts still remain that we were building up a tremendous steam on the livestock front. And now let's talk about what the game plan is for 1975. Last week, the Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, Clayton Yoder, made a speech somewhere, and I read it, and it didn't make me feel much better, because he said that next year farmers could and would, weather permitting, produce 7 billion bushels of corn. And then if we take 7 billion bushels of corn, and if we come up with 1.5 billion of soybeans, and if we come up, because there's no acreage control of any kind, no allocations for wheat, if we come up with 2 2/10 billion bushels of wheat, which we can do, then I just want to say to you that next year we're going to be looking at a price situation with as high, weather permitting, it could be 3 billion bushels of extra feed grains, soybeans, and wheat. Now then, people say to me, well, don't worry about it, Tony. The world is hungry. And there's a strong demand for grain and a strong demand for meat. And I say to them, but the people who need it most in the world and in this country haven't got the purchasing power to buy it. And when we had the summit conference in Chicago and in Washington, D.C., there was plenty of talk about cutting the federal budget, including the international front, including Food for Peace. And so we're not even going to be spending as much money now as George McGovern spent 10 years ago when he was a Food for Peace administrator. We're not going to spend that kind of money because everything's being cut back. And the countries of the world, and remember, the less developed countries of the world last year in 1973, these are the poor countries, they bought 31% of our exports. And they're not going to be able to buy 31% of exports on agriculture this year or next year. And they're not going to be able to buy it because they've got energy costs now that they have to wrestle with and come to grips with, and they're not going to be able to spend as much for food. And some people say to me, well, they got to eat, so they're going to have to buy food. They're not going to buy gas. Well, they have to also have some energy, some fuel, and they're going to buy as little of it as they need, but they're going to buy some. And whatever they buy, that much less food they're going to buy. So when people talk to me about the strong demand around the world, that's a bunch of hogwash. The demand is there, but the money isn't there to buy it. And that's why we've got to give some realistic thought to what we start doing in the... And you know, what saddens me, and I know you, is that weather in India and Bangladesh and in Africa could mean that millions of people might starve. Millions have. We just didn't know about it. We didn't know what was happening in Africa. But millions will probably starve in the months ahead, and there isn't much we can do about it. And the reason there isn't much we can do about it is because in 1972, for whatever kind of political rationale that Secretary Butts can put behind it, we retired 60 million acres of land. You know, we could have gone about the business of joining with Germany and Japan and other countries and building some world reserves. But you know, reserves is a bad word, even among farmers. Because too often reserves have been used to dump onto the market and depress prices. I came to a parting of the ways with Secretary Freeman over that issue. But it doesn't have to be that way. And to those people who are hung up and worried about reserves, I've just got one question I'd like to ask them. Let's forget about reserves. Let's just ask the one question. What are you going to do with surpluses if and when they come? What would we have done with them this year? What if we had 6 and 7, 10 billions of bushels of corn? And what if we had over 2 billion bushels of wheat? You know, we'd have too much. There isn't a market around the world that's necessarily going to buy that. Well, I just asked the question, until such time as you have to tailor production, and hopefully we wouldn't have to if we can find out some way of really trading with the nations of the world. But if there's too much, just remember, when there's a surplus, your price is going to drop. Your price will drop when there's a surplus. And a reserve is only a game plan to do something with a surplus, something intelligent, you know, something that makes sense. And you got to do that beforehand and not after you've got the surplus. Well, I wanted to touch, Ben, on this business of surplus because I've been getting some static from farmers who say we don't want reserves because they might raise the devil with us on prices. Well, reserves is one way of getting the kind of support we need from consumers, from religious people, from labor. They want some assurance for tomorrow. And we've got to get it in such a way that it isn't going to be dumped on the market to hurt us. And we've got to remember that if we don't have it, we're going to get clobbered anyway the first day we have too much feed grains. And I remind you that we need farm programs, because after all of the things I've heard, and in recent months I've been carrying on correspondence. We've been exchanging tapes with a man who's been well known here in the livestock front, good friend of mine, who's really been in this thing for a long, long time, Homer Ayers. And as I visit, there's always one thing comes out, that as you look back over a couple, 3 decades, that old cycle of cheap feed and cheap livestock just comes up time after time when you review the history. And so our immediate priority is to do something about the farm program we have. We've got to have some adequate floors below it so that their farmers will have incentive to produce, to do the kind of production that the president wants. And then there's got to be something, a reserve program if we produce too much. And then there's got to be an international program that says we need to sit down. Well, you've been reading in recent months how Secretary Kissinger is trying to get the nations that have too much oil to sit down with the nations that import oil and work out an international arrangement so that there can be some sensible way of ironing out price and supply. And what Secretary Kissinger is trying to do on the energy front in the world, you know, that's what we need to be doing about the food front. That's it. That's all it is, really. That's what an international commodity agreement, international arrangements are, of the people who produce too much sitting down with the people who haven't enough and working out prices so that both can live. So that both can live. Then let me close by saying that just not very many weeks away from now, we're going to have an election, and I hope that all of you here will think hard and long about that election and about making sure that here in South Dakota at every level you do what's good for farmers. You know, let's just one time remember what's good for farmers, and in this time in history when this nation and the world needs farmers as no other time in history, because they need food. If we make the right kind of decisions and elect the kind of people that we know are going to do the right thing for agriculture, all of the other things will fall in place, because it'll come out right for the other segments of the society. But let's just remember that, let's take a look at ourselves in terms of what is it we've got to have. What kind of friends do we have to have? So I ask you, and folks have heard me say this before, it's hard to live in a democracy. It's a lot easier to live where you don't have to work at politics. It's a lot easier to live in some country where you don't have to do a darn thing. But if you're going to make our system of government work, you've got to get into it. You can't say politics is a dirty business and the Watergate's a terrible thing and I don't want a thing to do. A friend of mine in Iowa went out to register people in rural America, not in the cities. He wasn't in Des Moines. He went out in rural areas, and he heard young farmers say that as far as they were concerned, they wanted to drop an atomic bomb on Washington, D.C. and wipe it off the face of the earth. And as far as they were concerned, they wanted to bomb Des Moines, the Des Moines capital, and run it off the face of the earth. This is America, 1974, young farmers out in Iowa saying that kind of thing. And that's why it's necessary of those of us who really believe and who want to make this form of government work, we've got to do more than just talk about it. We've got to go out and make sure that people come out and vote on election day. And if you've got a candidate you're pushing for, give them a card. Go and ask them to vote for him. That's the way this system of government works, and we haven't made it work. And if that's all we're going to get, if that's all Watergate has meant, that we're not going to now really sit down and make our democracy work, then God help us. So I call on you here just before the election, let's go out and make this democracy work. Let's go out and campaign for people that we think will do the right thing. No one else going to do it. We've got to do it. I wish you Godspeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. That fine address. And Tony, we're right on time. How about that? I saw Harvey Wallman here a while ago, the Senate Majority Leader and the candidate for Lieutenant Governor. I'd like to introduce him if he's still in the place. Is Harvey still? Right back there. Harvey Wallman. Harvey told me he's going to be around most of tomorrow. And Harvey, we have a little social activity gathering over at the hotel later. And Harvey's a Farmers Union member and a farmer. So Harvey, just feel like this is your meeting, because it is. Okay, I'm supposed to plug the tickets for the meals tomorrow. The breakfast tomorrow morning at 6:30, the UN luncheon, and of course the smorgasbord. And then I've been asked to suggest you pick up.
Well, is Bishop James Armstrong, Senator McGovern, Senator Everett, Senator Clark, farmers and friends of South Dakota. It's a rare privilege to be here on this particular day, and especially to share in the significance of this noon occasion, because I know of nothing that is of greater importance to the human race than a better understanding of shared responsibility and a commitment to a network of international cooperation. And this, of course, is precisely what the United Nations is all about. I shared, as most of you did, in the panel this morning in the arena. I don't know that there was one of these candidates for office that did not indicate that the problems related to the farmer in South Dakota must somehow be viewed against the backdrop of a global context. We can no longer isolate ourselves from other sections of the world, dealing only with our own needs and our own problems, insensitive to the community of man that exists about us. There has been a growing awareness of this in the 20th century. The League of Nations was a brief, ill-fated dream. The United Nations, following on the heels of the Second World War, has been able to accomplish, in spite of frailty and limitation, a remarkable amount of good in our world. This year, this summer, there are all kinds of symbols of this kind of acknowledged need. In the month of August in Bucharest, there was a World Conference on Population. And there the debate raged as to whether the primary difficulties facing the human family are related to overpopulation on the one hand, or to consumerism among the affluent nations of the earth on the other. And in the center of the debate were those interests which you represent. Next month, and Senator McGovern will be a delegate to that meeting, there will be a World Conference on Hunger in Rome. And again, you and all of those things you represent will be in the center of the consideration and the debate. Last month I was privileged to serve as a delegate to the Second World Conference on Peace and Religion in Louvain, Belgium. There were people from all over the world representing every conceivable religion: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Shintoism, Hinduism, Confucianism. Sikhs were there. We sought, as we came together, to pool insight, understanding, to share those values we feel and felt committed to in the light of needs, to alleviate hunger and poverty, to deal with the perennial problem of war, to relate to the challenges of liberation and development and human rights, and to deal specifically with conflicts in Southern Africa and Northern Ireland, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, the continuing war in Southeast Asia that grinds on and on and on. Cardinal Sunens, the host prelate, in greeting the dignitaries from around the world, said two or three things in his statement that I think are worthy of repetition here. He said, in facing the problems confronting the human family, we can no longer think in provincial or national or even continental terms. There must be an intercontinental approach to human problems. And then, quoting a statesman of our time, he said, there is no way to address the fundamental human problems of our world unless we approach them as world problems. Anything else is to deny the reality we must deal with. Consider the crises that you have here been touching upon and that we read of every day in our newspapers. Hunger, famine, poverty, this desire for liberation and tendency toward revolution, police state corruption, oppression, injustice, tyranny, ecological imbalance, environmental crisis, nuclear weaponry, the widening chasm between the haves and the have-nots of this world. There is no way for any of us as individuals or as isolated nations, no matter how great, no matter how strong, there is no way for any of us to address these issues unless we do it together. We cannot do it separately any longer. In fact, it was one of our most illustrious forefathers, Tom Paine, the revolutionary pamphleteer, who said, "My country is the world." That becomes increasingly important. As the world has evolved through its earliest stages, we find it moving into many different systems of organization. Anthropologists tell us that we began as nomadic wanderers or in caves. And then we organized as tribes, and then as city-states, and then as nation-states. But now that is no longer adequate in and of itself alone. 200 years ago, the Continental Congress of the United States met for the first time. Now, 200 years later, we live in an entirely different world. Then it took weeks to cross an ocean, months to cross a continent. The most decisive battle of the War of 1812 was fought after the war was over. But people in New Orleans did not understand that a treaty had been signed across the ocean in Ghent, ending that war. We can no longer continue to live in isolation, for transportation and communication and methods of trade and marketing and food production, the thought forms that drive us from decision to decision are such today so that we must learn how to live together if we are to survive as a race of people. Just briefly, think of the crises that are upon us in terms of our natural resources and our human resources. 71% of this Earth's surface is ocean water, and that ocean water has become a sort of global trash can. Each year, we spill deliberately or accidentally half a million tons No, 500,000, I guess that's 500,000 tons of oil into the ocean depths. We spill our radioactive wastes, our industrial wastes, our human wastes, our herbicides and pesticides and all kinds of chemicals into those waters. And marine scientists tell us that 50 years from now, if these trends continue, all marine life will be dead in these salt waters. And in our lands there are the freshwater streams and rivers and lakes. They too are becoming filled with waste, polluted. We're told in this country that Lake Erie is critically ill, that Lake Michigan is seriously ill, that parts of the Ohio River and the southern reaches of the Colorado River are dead. The Potomac has been called for one reason or another a floating cesspool. That's the nature of the water resources of our world today. And our land resources are also in jeopardy. There are only 4 or 5 nations on the face of this earth that produce enough food to feed their own people and have enough margin left to make a substantial contribution to hunger in other nations as well. Only 4 or 5. That means that every other nation on the face of the earth is at the mercy of the climatic conditions, the production techniques, the internal politics, the international power plays of these 4 or 5 nations. Forests are being cut down. Depending upon the level of development of the culture, timber is used for food, for fuel, or for building, or for paper. And yet, over and above that, forests are being cleared that agriculture might be introduced, and as these lands are denuded, the soil is prepared for erosion and flooding and further destruction. Mineral resources are shrinking. It was long assumed that an industrial society such as ours would need to have coal and that coal would always be available to us. Now we know that's not necessarily so. In recent months, we have become painfully aware of the necessity of petroleum. The technologically advanced nations on this earth, at the mercy of petroleum, discover that they are no longer self-sufficient. And 40 million Arabs now have a control over the majority of the oil reserves that are existent on the face of the earth. Suddenly, and this is a new feeling for people like us, decisions made in Kuwait affect hundreds of millions of lives as truly as do decisions made on Wall Street or in Moscow. Natural resources that are somehow escaping from the grasp of a rapidly developing human family must somehow be preserved if life on this planet is to be sustained. And they cannot be preserved if particular favored nations hoard their resources at the expense of less favored nations. Either we will learn to cooperate, learn to function together on a basis of mutual respect, or we will fail, miserably fail, the challenge that is before us. More important, however, than these natural resources are the human resources that are in such desperate jeopardy today. There are 3 worlds on this earth. The first world is the capitalist world of Western Europe and the United States and Japan. The second world is the world of communist superpowers, the People's Republic of China, the Soviet Union. But the third world is a world of helplessness, of poverty, of powerlessness. Some of these nations are large geographically and filled with people, others are small and sparsely settled. But the fact is that however large or small, however many people may be there, these nations stand stripped of power and potential in the presence of 20th century reality. There are 700 million illiterates in that world, the third world, 100 million more than there were 20 years ago. There are 230 million unemployed people in that world and hundreds of millions more who do not have the mixed benefits of a wage economy. Last year was called the Year of the Famine. The most widespread drought in the recorded history of Africa swept across the sub-Sahara region. But the tentacles of that year have reached into this year. The famine has spread on eastward into Addis Ababa, so that now northern Africa and Pakistan, tragically Bangladesh, India, the northeastern pocket of Brazil are all plagued by the stark reality of starvation. 400 million people are threatened with the possibility of literal starvation. And 2 out of 3 people on the face of this planet suffer from malnutrition and will go to bed hungry tonight. And we are the farmers of the breadbasket of the world. 20% of the population of that developing world is under 5 years of age. 60% of the deaths suffered in that world are suffered by children under 5 years of age. And 2/3 of those youngsters who manage somehow to survive will be forever retarded, emotionally, mentally, physically, because they have not received enough food, a sufficient balanced diet to get an even start in life. I attended the Third United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in Santiago, Chile in the spring of 1972. Robert McNamara, president of the World Bank, was one of those who keynoted that conference. He referred to this developing world, the third world, and he described it with these words. He said, "It is a world in which death and disease are rampant, education and employment are scarce, squalor and stagnation are common, and the fulfillment of individual potential is well nigh impossible." And hundreds of millions of people live in that world while we live in this. About half of the people on the face of the earth today live in nations with a per capita income of $100 per year or less. About a quarter of us live in nations with a per capita income of between $100 and $1,000. About a quarter of us live in nations with a per capita income exceeding $1,000. In 1970, the per capita income of the United States was $4,100. The per capita income of India was $92. 3 decades hence, according to those who know about such things, in the year 2000, our per capita income will be about $10,000 per year. The per capita income in India, about 215. A ratio of more than 50 to 1 will divide the have-nots and the haves in these two massive nations. And the United Nations represents that reality in our world today that is equipped to reach out and sensitize the conscience of the human race, enabling those of us who have so much to plan realistically with those who have so little, that our shared plight might be improved and that our world might be made a greener place, and that lives all over might derive benefit from our insight and our idealism. On May 1st of 1974, the General Assembly of the United Nations passed a resolution calling for a new international economic order. It may well have been one of the most important documents, if not the most important document, the General Assembly has approved. Let me read simply one of the introductory paragraphs. This new international economic order, the General Assembly said, will be based on equity, sovereign equality, interdependence, common interest and cooperation among all states, irrespective of their economic and social systems, which shall correct inequalities and redress existing injustices, make it possible to eliminate the widening gap between the developed and the developing countries, and ensure steadily accelerating economic and social development and peace and justice for present and future generations. In the light of the crises, the challenges I have mentioned and you full well know about, is anything less than this sort of international cooperation based upon mutual respect, with the necessity of grudging concessions acknowledged, is anything less than this possible? If we are to move into the future unafraid? There's a story in the New Testament that we don't like to think too much about. It's a parable that speaks of a man named Lazarus who squatted by the doorstep of a wealthy home day after day after day. His bony hands were held outstretched, waiting for alms and crumbs to be dropped into them. He was a sick man, and dogs came and licked his open wounds. In that house, a man named Dives lived. He was not a bad man, not a malevolent man, not a sinful man at all. He wore blinders. He would leave his house and get in his air-conditioned car and go to his air-conditioned office and work all day and come back to his air-conditioned home and put his blinders back on as he walked by the man who was squatting there in misery on his doorstep. Now again, he was a man of wealth, of affluence, who lived in comfort, who was a good man probably, not a bad man. He was not a sinful man. But he refused to acknowledge the need that squatted on his doorstep day by day. And the master storyteller says he went to hell. There is so much we who are the most privileged people on the face of this earth have to learn about the nature of reality beyond the worlds in which we dwell. The suffering out there, the need out there, the hunger, the starvation out there. And it's through the instrumentalities of a world body like the United Nations, and it's the body we have, that we are able to work through the structures and the systems and the harnessed idealism of our time to meet the needs of our time. John Steinbeck was one of the most gifted, earthy men of letters this century has produced. And in his social tract, the ponderous masterpiece, Grapes of Wrath, he placed upon the lips of a crude old preacher named Casey these words: I ain't saying I'm like Jesus was, but got tired like him, and I got mixed up like him, and I went out in the wilderness like him without no camping stuff. Nighttime, I'd lay down and look up at the stars. Morning, I'd watch the sun come up. Midday, I'd look out from the hills at the rolling, dry country. Evening, I'd follow the sun down. Sometimes I'd pray like I always done, only I didn't know what I was praying to or for. There was the hills, and there was me, and we wasn't separate no longer. We was one thing. That one thing was holy. And I got to thinking, only it wasn't thinking, it was deeper down than thinking. I got to thinking how we was holy when we was one thing, and how mankind was holy when it was one thing, and how we only got unholy when one miserable little fella got the bit in his own teeth and run off his own way a kicking and a dragging and a fighting. fellow like that busts the holiness. But when we all work together, not one fella for another fella, but one fella kind of harnessed to the whole shebang, then that's good. That's right. That's holy. And it is for that reason that there are few expressions of human idealism more holy, more sacred on the contemporary scene than the United Nations. Bless this Farmers Union for its interest in the United Nations, and for all you do in the development of policy and the making of political decision and the directions in which you lead an agricultural economy. Bless you for all you do to fulfill the kind of global idealism that acknowledges our interdependence and that reinforces a mature concept of humanity, so that none of us are enabled to live at the expense of others else. God bless you.
They come to the